To the extent that these values are interpreted as cultural, we distinguish them from such levels of growth of their innate energies that they may accomplish, as it were, by themselves, and that are only the raw material for the process of civilization, like wood and metal, plants and electricity. By cultivating objects, that is by increasing their value beyond the performance of their natural constitution, we cultivate ourselves. It is the same value-increasing process developing out of us and returning back to us that moves external nature or our own nature. The fine arts reflect this concept of culture most clearly because they display the greatest tension between these opposites. For the shaping of the object seems completely to escape being adapted to the process of our subjectivity. The work of art interprets the meaning of the phenomenon itself, whether it is embedded in the shaping of space or in the relations of colors or in the spirituality that exists, as it were, both in and beneath the visible. Yet everything depends on discovering the meaning and secret of things in order to represent them in a form that is purer and clearer than their natural development, not, however, in the sense of chemical or physical technology, which explores the law-like nature of objects in order to incorporate them into human purposes that are intrinsic to them. Rather, the artistic process is completed as soon as it has succeeded in presenting the object in its unique significance. This, in fact, also fulfills the purely artistic ideal, since the perfection of the work of art is an objective value in itself, completely independent of its success in our subjective experience. The slogan L'art pour l'art characterizes perfectly the self-sufficiency of the purely artistic tendency. But from the standpoint of a cultural ideal, the situation is different. Here it is essential that the independent values of aesthetic, scientific, ethical, eudaimonistic and even religious achievements are transcended in order to integrate them all as elements in the development of human nature beyond its natural state. More accurately, they are the milestones which this development has to pass. At each moment cultural development is located somewhere along this road. It never can proceed purely formally and independently of some content even though it is not identical with this content. Cultural contents consist of those forms, each of which is subordinate to an autonomous ideal, though here they are viewed from the standpoint of the development of our energies or our being beyond the degree considered to be purely natural. In refining objects, man creates them in his own image. The cultural process, as the supernatural growth of the energies of Th1 ings, is the manifestation or embodiment of the identical growth of our energies. The borderline at which the development of specific life content passes from its natural form into its cultural form is indistinct and is subject to controversy. But this is merely one of the most universal difficulties of thought. The categories under which specific phenomena are subsumed in order to incorporate them into knowledge, its norms and relationships, are marked off from each other and often gain their meaning only from this contrast. These concepts form sequences with discontinuous levels. Yet the particulars that are supposed to be covered by these concepts usually cannot be located with the same degree of certainty. Rather, their quantitative characteristics often determine whether they belong to the one or the other concept so that, because of the continuity of everything quantitative and the ever-possible intermediate position between two entities, each of which corresponds to a specific category, the specific phenomenon may well be placed sometimes with one, sometimes with the other. Thus there seems to be an indeterminacy between them, even a mixture of concepts which, according to their actual meaning, exclude one another. The fundamental certainty of the demarcation between nature and culture, that the one starts where the other leaves off, is just as little affected by the uncertainty as to where to locate individual phenomena as are the concepts of day and night, which do not merge into one another because dawn and dusk may sometimes be attributed to the one, sometimes to the other. The increase in material culture and the lag in individual culture. I will now contrast this discussion of the general concept of culture with a specific relationship within contemporary culture. If one compares our culture with that of 100 years ago, then one may surely say, subject to many individual exceptions, that the things that determine and surround our lives, such as tools, means of transport, the products of science, technology and art, are extremely refined. Yet individual culture, at least in the higher strata, has not progressed at all to the same extent. Indeed, it has even frequently declined. This does not need to be shown in detail. I only wish, therefore, to emphasize some aspects of it. Linguistic possibilities for expression, in German as well as in French, have become much more refined and subtle in the last 100 years. Not only do we now have Goethe's language, but in addition we have a large number of refinements, subtleties and individual modes of expression. Yet, if one looks at the speech and writing of individuals, they are on the whole increasingly less correct, less dignified and more trivial. In terms of content, the scope of objects of conversation has been widened during that time through advances in theory and practice, yet, nonetheless, it seems that conversation, both social as well as intimate and in the exchange of letters, is now more superficial, less interesting and less serious than at the end of the 18th century. The fact that machinery has become so much more sophisticated than the worker is part of this same process. How many workers are there today, even within large-scale industry, who are able to understand the machine with which they work, that is the mental effort invested in it? The same applies to military culture. The work of the individual soldier has essentially remained the same for a long time, and in some respects has even been reduced through modern methods of warfare. In contrast, not only the material instruments but, above all, the completely impersonal organization of the army have become extremely sophisticated and a real triumph of objective culture. In the purely intellectual sphere, even the best informed and most thoughtful persons work with a growing number of ideas, concepts and statements, the exact meaning and content of which they are not fully aware. The tremendous expansion of objective, available material of knowledge allows or even enforces the use of expressions that pass from hand to hand like sealed containers without the condensed content of thought actually enclosed within them being unfolded. For the individual user, just as our everyday life is surrounded more and more by objects of which we cannot conceive how much intellectual effort is expended in their production, so our mental and social communication is filled with symbolic terms, in which a comprehensive intellectuality is accumulated, but of which the individual mind need make only minimal use. The preponderance of objective over subjective culture that developed during the 19th century is reflected partly in the fact that the 18th century pedagogic ideal was focused upon the formation of man, that is upon a personal internal value, which was replaced during the 19th century, however, by the concept of education in the sense of a body of objective knowledge and behavioral patterns. This discrepancy seems to widen steadily. Every day and from all sides, the wealth of objective culture increases, but the individual mind can enrich the forms and contents of its own development only by distancing itself still further from that culture and developing its own at a much slower pace. How can we explain this phenomenon? If all the culture of things is, as we saw, nothing but a culture of people, so that we develop ourselves only by developing things, then what does that development, elaboration and intellectualization of objects mean, which seems to evolve out of these objects' own powers and norms without correspondingly developing the individual mind? This implies an accentuation of the enigmatic relationship which prevails between the social life and its products on the one hand and the fragmentary life contents of individuals on the other. The labor of countless generations is embedded in language and custom, political constitutions and religious doctrines, literature and technology as objectified spirit from which everyone can take as much of it as they wish to or are able to, but no single individual is able to exhaust it all. Between the amount of this treasure and what is taken from it, there exists the most diverse and fortuitous relationships. The insignificance or irrationality of the individual's share leaves the substance and dignity of mankind's ownership unaffected, just as any physical entity is independent of its being individually perceived.